have found ourselves suddenly immersed in John's Gospel once again for the first time since the Easter season. We've left Mark for a moment. We're here in a complex passage, a la John always. But first, Kelvin, Jonathan, Peg, welcome. Let's see if we can unpack this a little. I find, some of these real key John signs, John clues, John themes. Let's see if we can find them together. Kelvin, you've got some background for us.
Well, this is a fascinating chapter here. We've got the one miracle which is recorded in all of the Gospels. That's the feeding of the multitude. And as well as these, the feeding of the 5,000, of course, there's the story of the feeding of the 4,000, which is in Matthew and Mark. So 6 passages in the New Testament which tell of Jesus feeding a multitude from nothing, which makes you think it must be a pretty important passage. And some of that importance is hinted at in John's Gospel. And to appreciate this chapter in John's Gospel, you've got to think of the structure of the Gospel. John says at the end of the Gospel that basically he knows more about Jesus than he could ever write in any book. And the implication of that is that he has selected very carefully the stories that he's telling, and he's selected them for very specific purposes. And the structure of John's Gospel is that it has 7 signs, 7 miracles. There's the water to wine, there's the healing of the nobleman's son, the pool, healing at the pool of Bethesda, and then the feeding of the 5,000 and walking on water, which are tonight's passages. And then we've got the man born blind and the raising of Lazarus. These 7 signs. 7 is not an accident. That's the perfect number in the ancient days. And each of these signs is accompanied by a passage of, I guess you could say, word. So you've got picture and word. It's like a wonderful story from National Geographic, where you can look at the pictures and get some of the information, or you can read the body of the text and get some of the information, but you won't get everything until you put them together. And this passage is mirrored by the passage which follows it, which is that long passage about the bread of life and about coming to Jesus and being fed by him. And the bread that he gives is his food for the life of the world. And that importance is really why these stories are repeated time and time again in the Gospel. I think that there is a strong connection between the Eucharistic life of the early church and these stories. But each of these signs, and these 2 signs included in that, we tend to sort of atomize them and think of them as stories in their own right, which of course they are. But a better way of looking at them would be to look at them as 7 different aspects of the purpose and the ministry and the being of Jesus. And the 7 signs together give us an indication of who Jesus is and what he came for.
So the 7 signs are like a striving towards that perfection that we've talked about, and the signs are, as you say, incredibly important. Now, there's a few other questions that I hope we can address as we go on, but I won't raise them now. But I will ask Peg to start what you find challenging.
What I find challenging in this passage, actually, when I look at the first part, the challenge is that it really doesn't have a lot to do about bread, but it's about meeting the needs of the people and Jesus meeting their needs. They came because they wanted to see signs. But in fact, it is those signs that can be a stumbling block to their faith, because they preferred the signs than seeing who Jesus really is.
And interestingly, I think we've all lived through a period when I was going to say signs and wonders, that might be a giveaway, but the dramatics overtook the gospel, I think. So that's a very important point that you flagged. Jonathan, for you, the challenge?
Gosh, I realize that my reading of this is somewhat superficial, because, there is good news, and we'll come to that. It's demonstrated. But I've always found this event, the feeding of the 5,000, less than satisfying somehow. Not because Some healing in Matthew's version is all that takes place aside from the provision of the food. But because we don't hear from Jesus much, aside from his intercourse with the disciples, I'd like to know what Jesus had to say to the crowd, but that's just my curiosity, I suppose. And as with Jesus walking on the water, these miracles, these signs, come dangerously close, I think, to looking like the work of a magician. Obviously, there are deeper insights which I've not delved into, but I've often thought that.
And interestingly, last week's reading, we have Mark desperately showing that Jesus is not a magician, John perhaps sliding down that way in this reading. And also he's got this thing which comes out here of, oh, Jesus is only just doing this to test the disciples. And I rest uncomfortably with that. So you might pick that up, Kelvin, but you might pick up other things. What's the challenge for you?
Well, the challenge for me is the second little story, the walking on the water, which I've just talked about the sign and word aspect of John's gospel, but doesn't apply to this sign. It's sort of tacked onto the end, and I think that actually it's not a separate sign. It's part of the feeding of the 5,000. And I think that with all of these stories, it's the symbolic significance which is the most important thing. The little boat, which is a symbol of the church and the symbol of our own individual lives, I suppose, in the middle of a storm. And Jesus comes, and where is Jesus? And he's not on the shore that they're going to. He's not on the place that they've just left. He's there in the middle of the storm. And for me, that is a very powerful message in this story.
It is, and it's only a few weeks, of course, since we had the Mark version of the stilling of the storm. And interestingly, I think it's the World Council of Churches that pick up that little boat in a storm. So there's lots to explore. Let's unpack some good news and ask you, Jonathan, to begin to give us some good news.
Okay. Well, not unusual for John. These signs which Jesus performs are a demonstration of something more, and we're informed that it is near Passover. So John has planted the Exodus in our minds, and he then has Jesus providing bread and more, and John has the people saying, "This indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world." And we now have Moses in mind, but more than Moses. In fact, the crowd makes a remarkable leap from Moses to the Messiah to the King of Israel. And all this gives us is the good news of liberation and more, which is extremely good news. And Jesus is inaugurating the kingdom of God, and just as important, how we behave as subjects of the kingdom. But I'll keep that for the next section.
But the crafting of this is remarkable. Kelvin, good news?
For me, the good news is the little boy who gives his lunch over, and I mean, ridiculous. He's this little kid's lunch in a brown paper bag that his mum's put together for him, and Jesus takes it and takes him seriously, says a grace over it, and begins to distribute it, and it's enough. And for me, the good news is, here we are, all different versions of that little boy with our pathetic little offering, and we offer it to Jesus, and it's actually enough, and it always will be enough.
And that is so deeply heartwarming. Peg,
Well,
news.
The good news is very much, my good news was like Calvin's good news about Jesus assuring us that he is present, and that whatever expectations we bring to that relationship, he meets us and we have a real encounter with him, whether it's being fed or meeting our faith assured or going beyond the signs to touching our hearts. That's the good news for me. Yeah. And as that little girl with that fish and loaves, I also offer what little I have and hope that God will make big things out of it.
Thank you. And it's such a powerful image, that offering and seeing that offering blessed. Let's ask you again, Peg, to keep rolling and tell me how you might apply all this. So what?
Well, I think it is trusting that Jesus is present with me and taking what little I have when I feel not enough, when I feel that what I have to offer isn't going to be very much, and trusting that God through Jesus will do great things, that it's and not letting the signs and wonders that you were alluding to, especially in my teen years. I looked for the signs and wonders. I needed some affirmation that Christ was really with me, walking beside me as my friend and brother, and to just trust that Jesus is with me and allowing my small gifts to be used for the kingdom of God.
Isn't it amazing? That's such a personal perspective, and I think we can all draw that from here. And yet there's other more global perspectives. Let's see where we go with Jonathan. So what?
Well, if Jesus' actions are a demonstration of his work as a liberator and a provider, there are other actions that are strong pointers as to how we might conduct ourselves in these kingdom circumstances. When Jesus says to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread to feed these people?" he immediately gets his disciples thinking, and it's Andrew who comes up with a tentative suggestion. There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Now, whether Andrew is expecting Jesus to perform a miracle is, of course, a moot point, but what, in effect, he does is come up with something of a solution which he brings to Jesus. And my suggestion here is very close to what Kelvin said. Our best efforts presented to Jesus is about as good as we can get. And I'm not sure God expects much more. And whether things turn out as spectacularly as they do in this story, or whether they simply result in someone being loved, it doesn't really matter. Once we've presented our best efforts to Jesus, we've done what we can do.
And again, I'm reminded of those beautiful words in the liturgy of offering ourselves as a living sacrifice, which this kid does. And sometimes it's big scale, sometimes it's small, but deep from our heart. Kelvin, so what?
Well, the so what for me really comes from I guess you'd say, the bigger passage. There's the sign and the word, and which follows on with Jesus saying that he is the bread of life, the life that's given to the people. The bread is Jesus. And he says, if you eat of this bread, you won't hunger, you won't thirst. And I look at myself and I do hunger and thirst, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, mentally. And this passage is a reminder to me of the work I still have to do in bringing myself to Jesus in order that I might receive what he has to give me.
It's a passage that takes us deep into the heart. It really does, and it's challenging, it's heartwarming. It takes us on into the middle of the year with some very deep encounters with the Christ. Kelvin, Peg, Jonathan, thanks for joining me, and this little return to John and an excursion into these very deep signs that are offered by Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.